First, I just want to thank you all for including me in this. It's been an amazing experience, and I'm so impressed with all the things that you have been able to do and the things that are likely to come out of this group. So thank you. I am not an expert in SC2NA. I know 2 children who have it, who are wonderful, but I've been doing autism for a long time, so that is what I'm going to talk about. And I need to tell you, I'm not trying to sell you anything, but I do get royalties from diagnostic instruments and have had funding from a whole variety of places, but not very relevant to this. So I'm going to start really briefly because I'm assuming most of you know what autism is, but I think 2 thoughts that I just want to start with to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. And the first is just that autism is a neurobiological condition that affects how kids learn and process information. And so having autism means that kids don't communicate as easily and as automatically using nonverbal skills like eye contact or facial expression or vocalizations. And they also probably pay attention to somewhat different aspects of the world. They may be looking at lights or maybe thinking about icons or various things that are very interesting to them that are not bad, they're just different from what other people are doing. And these differences then can affect learning and can affect opportunities to practice what kids have learned. It doesn't mean they can't learn anything. It just means that they need different help. And I think, again, coming back to it, why would anyone want a diagnosis of autism? Why is it worth having this? I think it's because there is a particular constellation of behaviors that start very early in development that mean that kids need somewhat different opportunities to learn and develop. And in order to do this, they need to get this help, sometimes a lot of help, sometimes a little help, to be happy, healthy, and as independent as possible. I think how many of these behaviors you have to have autism or autism spectrum is debatable. There are right now very arbitrary but replicable boundaries. I can teach you where I divide the line between autism and not autism. It doesn't mean that it's right. It just means that's where the line is right now. And it's moved around in the last few years. I think the thing to ask ourselves with any individual child is, will this diagnosis help them? Will thinking about the things that we know about how to help autistic kids help this child? And can we use this to support the child and better understand the child? And that should be the basis. And the other thing to remember is these things change across time and with experience. So there are people who had diagnoses of autism who as adults don't need a lot of help, and there are people who will need a lot of help, but different kinds of help at different times. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but autism is defined by difficulties in 2 areas. And one of the biggest scientific questions we have is, why these 2 things? Why is it related? Why is not looking at people instantaneously related to flicking your fingers? It is, but we don't know. So there are basic deficits in social behavior that go from very simple things like facial expressions and eye contact to the idea of how easy is it for you to take turns and understand at a very simple level the idea of social reciprocity, all the way up to the fact that relationships for autistic people, even those who are very smart, may be quite different than those for other people. And even people who have relationships, we have married patients who are close to their spouse, but still struggle with things like work, where people may have different expectations of, I'm your boss, I'm not your boss, but I'm your supervisor, I'm your mentor, I'm your friend, and trying to sort out who's who can be quite difficult. Along with this, and this is what really doesn't make a lot of sense right now, is that autistic people, by definition, have some kind of restricted or repetitive or sensory behavior. They don't have to have all of them. The only person I know who had all of them is Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man, managed to pull them all off in 90 minutes. But they have to have some of these things. And what's interesting there is all of us have some of these things, but not as many, and they don't get in our way as much. And some of these things don't very much get into people's ways, like flapping. It does not hurt anybody. But responses to sensations can, if you're really bothered by bright lights or noises. Having very restricted interests, again, on the whole, doesn't hurt anybody if you can switch and can broaden what you pay attention to. And difficulties with transitions and changes are very common across a wide variety of different disorders and developmental conditions. But for kids and adults with autism, it means we have to help them plan and have strategies to deal with this, or they'll be thrown off when they don't need to be. I think the other thing to remember is autism seldom comes by itself. There are people who just have pure autism, but having started out my life 30 years ago, we were looking for a gene for pure autism. We couldn't find, not only did we not find the gene, we couldn't even find the people, because autism often co-occurs with things such as ADHD. It co-occurs with intellectual disability, not all the time, but often. It often co-occurs with social anxiety or general anxiety, and sometimes with OCD, so the need to do things over and over beyond just having strong interests. And then there are a host of medical complications like we've talked about here, with sleep, with GI dysfunction, and as is very pertinent to your genetic disorders. So what I'm going to talk to you today is just one thing, which is a study we've been doing, which started out as a study of early diagnosis. And our idea was to see kids as young as possible. So we were able to see consecutive referrals, first to teach clinics in North Carolina, and then in Chicago, of kids under 3 years of age. And this was for a very large statewide program in North Carolina. If we heard of a family who called who had a child under 3, we just hightailed it literally over to wherever they were to be able to catch them when they were little. This was 30 years ago, so these kids were quite rare, but the question was, can kids be diagnosed with autism at age 2, and will it make a difference? So we have about a total of about 250 kids. We're still following hopefully about 150 of these families. And they're from rural, suburban, and urban families, not super upper middle class. We have a lot of, these were free assessments in North Carolina. Very working class population. About 20% are African American or Black, and about 80% white. And what we've done in this study, which I think is relevant to a lot of the things that we've talked about today, this is a natural history study, is we've been able to see these kids in person about every 2 years. So we go to these families, and we've seen them at 2, 3, 5, 9, 19, 26. We had a gap at 14 where we talked to them on the phone. And we also have kept kids in the study who do not have autism if they were referred. So we have 27 kids who have never gotten a diagnosis of autism. We also have deluged these poor parents with questionnaires and now online surveys about every 6 months. And around puberty, we sent them stuff every 3 months because we were interested in changes around puberty. Some of the kids have moved out of the spectrum. We have 13 out of the whole sample who really don't seem autistic at all now. But most have stayed in, and some of the kids have moved into the spectrum very gradually. And one of my main points here is that changes are gradual. So it's been wonderful today to listen to the proposals for treatment and cures for the genetic disorders, but that's not what we're doing behaviorally with these families. We don't have a cure yet. And the changes are tiny, but they do go in a direction. They do get better. And I think a related comment is that many of the kids who have never had a diagnosis of autism have outcomes very much like the autistic kids. I mean, it's really not worth fussing about it. They are in the same boat. They have slightly less significant social difficulties, but just slightly. So in some ways, identifying this subgroup of autism is very artificial. So we asked, can autism be reliably diagnosed at 2? We wondered if the miracles claimed by the behaviorists in the early 1990s were because they were treating kids who didn't really have autism who are 2. We wanted to know how could you diagnose 2-year-olds? And then we've hung on to these families for dear life for 30 years to be able to see how these kids grow up and what is different and what is the same. So this is a simpler graph than it looks like. Every red line is a kid. And this just shows their scores on a diagnostic measure where a 10 is as autistic as you can be during this 1-hour period, not over your whole life. And a 0 would mean no sign of autism. And the main point here is the 2 groups on the right account for 80% of the sample. And those are kids who stayed very much in the same range over time. There's much less variability. We thought there might be huge changes, for example, between 2 and 3 or 3 and 5. And this is just degree of autism, not other things. You'll see on the left, we had 10% of the sample who gradually got worse. And they were kids who had milder problems, and maybe we were just getting better at describing it, but they have gradually moved into autism. And we have 10% of the sample who gradually, with a few blips you can see in there, decreased. But on the whole, the diagnosis of autism and the severity of problems, again, seen in an hour, this is just that hour, were much more stable than we would have thought. I think this might be the most important slide I have, which is about changes in language. And this is just using the Vineland communication index in terms of ages or age equivalents. We can do very similar things looking at direct language testing, which are more sophisticated, but there you have to keep changing your language test as the kids get older. So the Vineland is helpful here. The thickness of the line shows how many kids were in that group. And there are 2 main points of this, 3 main points. One is our statistician discovered 7 groups in our sample, 7 different trajectories in this sample that at that time was about 200 kids. The trajectories range from the bottom line, which again is another point, everybody shows improvement. They gradually achieve changes, but some of the improvements are very slow. And this is not just additive. So you'll see the difference between 1 and 2 looks much bigger than the difference between 2 and 3 or 9 and 19. Another important point is if you look at age 2, although that looks like a big difference, it's not. We really could not predict eventual language skill from where kids were at age 2 by where they were in terms of communication measures. So we need to be really careful not to give up on kids who don't have much language at 2, and to think about what can they do at that time. But the second thing, which is more depressing, is if you look after age 5, we stop having these big swoops. You'll see between 2 and 5, there are numerous kids who are late bloomers who shoot up. After 5, things keep going up. So it's not that development stops, but the development is linear. So if a child is at about half their age level in language skills at 5, they will continue to learn at about half their age level. Whereas at 2, we don't know. That child could shoot up. And what this has made me do is just really bug people about the importance of working on communication in early years. Just doing everything they can, not just to get kids to talk, but to communicate and understand what other people are communicating to them in whatever way possible. It may be that alternative routes, like things like AAC, will help. These kids are kids, we have kids who are exposed to AAC, but nobody uses it. Not one of our sample uses it spontaneously. But that may be different with people's kids today who are starting earlier with more help. So we also asked, what about in school-age kids? What are the changes then, and what should we be looking at? And I'm just going to tell you a couple things here because I can't go on forever. The good news is that a lot of behavior problems. So here we've just got the aberrant behavior checklist, scales in hyperactivity, irritability, and social withdrawal. And you can see that pretty much everybody goes down. It's not gone in hyperactivity, but it definitely decreases pretty much for our whole sample, as does irritability, although slower. The one thing that we were worried about here, which has continued to be a factor in adults, is that social withdrawal, and this is withdrawal from parents, not from the whole world, actually increases for some of the brighter kids who are that middle line. And so we need to be careful about what's happening in our kids, to some extent pulling away from other people. This is looking at adaptive skills, so using Vineland's, which I know many of the studies here have used. And here, the group on the left is groups with lower IQs, so IQs below 70. Group on the right is over 70. But what struck me here, there is a relationship between IQ and adaptive skills, daily living skills. Can kids brush their teeth? Can they walk around the block? Can they make a sandwich? But what's really interesting is you see that yellow bar, half the kids in each group overlap. So half the kids with lower IQs look just the same as half the kids with higher IQs in adaptive skills. And I think what that tells me is that we can help kids learn to be more independent. We can help them make more choices for themselves if we create positive environments and stay on them. So high expectations, but a lot of support, no matter how low they are in terms of cognitive skills. It also means that we have brighter kids where nobody is doing that. And I think what happens is schools don't do it. Parents are exhausted. These kids give other people more grief about what people are asking them to do. And then nobody helps them. So they have a kid graduating from high school, and the mom is still measuring out 2 dollops of shampoo when they take a shower so that they don't dump the whole bottle on their head. So we need to do more about this, both to help kids that are less able because they can do more, and also to help kids who are more able, who are falling between the cracks. Here, I just want you to look at the top line, and the main point here is that after kids leave school, their adaptive skills begin to fall down. And so there's a cliff when kids leave structured learning. And I think many parents are faced with, what should my child do after high school? Is it worth them going to college? What should they be doing? And I think the point here is that they need to be doing something. So our goals for the last few years, because this sample is now an average of 34 years old, is to better understand the opportunities and the barriers that have consequences for them as adults. We also want to define what are achievable positive outcomes, even for the kids who are less cognitively able. And how did they get there? Because sometimes talking about a full-time job is irrelevant, or a child living completely independently. But what can we talk about and what will make a difference? And we want to relate current outcomes to our earlier data with the hope that we can learn about some milestones that, just like I'm bugging you about get help for communication in little kids, what can we do? So I'm going to give you examples of some very different people in different circumstances. And the reason I put the note in the red is that we have measured treatment that everybody gets for 30 years. On the whole, we can't relate that treatment to anything except kids who, when they were identified, their parents found somebody to work with who they stuck with for 20 sessions, basically once a week for 6 months, one provider, so they didn't go from person to person to person, and where the parents were involved as well. So parent involvement with a provider that they stuck with makes a difference of about 5 to 10 IQ points, 5 to 10 adaptive points, all kinds of things throughout life. Now, I don't think this is the treatment. I think it's the parents. And I'm talking to the choir here, but I think what you do does make a difference, even if it doesn't make your child's problems go away. So I'm going to show you just very quick clips of 4 different kids. Actually, first, I'm going to show you, these are tiles that we tried to use to describe adult outcomes. And this is first for people with limited intellectual ability or very limited language. And I should tell you, our sample is pretty bimodal, so the people with lower IQs, even though we cut their IQs at 70, the average IQ is closer to 30. So they are people who are quite delayed. And what we did was take the World Health Organization definition of quality of life. So it was in terms of sociability. So you can see on the little tiny tiles on the bottom left, we asked, does this person have anybody that isn't related to them and isn't paid to work with them who they likes to see? Like, it could be a roommate, it could be somebody who comes to visit them, it could be somebody they see at their yoga class. And you'll see about half, that's the blue, of these young people has somebody like that. We then asked, what are their daily living skills? And we set the bar at age 8 on the Vineland for daily living, because at 8, you're doing all your personal hygiene, so no one has to get in the shower with you or dress you. And you're doing a few chores around the house. We thought the idea of doing something for somebody else is a really important thing developmentally. And so you can see that about 40% of our sample met that. And then we looked at current activities. And there we looked at people who did have some kind of paid employment, which is the dark blue. So you see it's quite a small group. People that volunteered, green, people who went to some kind of day placement or workshop. And what was horrifying to us is about more than half of the sample were doing nothing. They were staying at home all day. Now, that doesn't mean they're truly doing nothing, but it does mean they had nowhere to go. When we combine all of these together, so we're looking at who had 3 points, 2 points, 1 point, or nothing, you'll see that way on the left, a very small group, but we should probably include the green, are doing fairly well in terms of these ways. But we also have about a third of the sample who have no friends, poor daily living, and are at home all day without any structured activity. Okay, so I'm going to just show you some examples of these young people. So this is a little boy who we met at 2 with his dad. He was one of the happiest kids I've ever seen. So he had poor motor skills, but he was so happy, and he had speech-like vocalizations. We thought he would talk pretty soon. He didn't. His language was very slow in coming, but he can talk some. And I think when I show you the clip at 30, we saw him at 25 and he wouldn't talk to us. And we were horrified. We thought, oh no. And his mother was like, he talks. I don't know what the problem is. Then we'll see him at 30. And I think, talking to some of the parents, I think we typically send these lovely young women who are research assistants into people's homes. The parents always say, oh, your girls are so lovely, which insults everyone in my lab. But I think he was just overwhelmed by these young women. But at 30, he rose to the occasion. At 30, he is living at home. He is very clean. So when we saw him, he had just learned to change sheets on a bed. And one of the problems was that he wanted to change the sheets all the time. And his grandmother had made a list of like when you can change the sheets, because otherwise they were spending constantly getting their sheets changed. But he has a part-time job in a local bakery. So he walks to the bakery, he works there for several hours a day, and then comes home. And I think the biggest issue for his parents is thinking about what's going to happen as they get older. But you'll see, he is as charming and as happy as ever.
One more thing. Can you take my picture?
He is great. Your picture.
I'm a smile.
That is a big, should we smile together?
When do you go to work?
It looks great.
So here is another little boy, another beautiful kid, and you'll see him at 2. We thought he had autism. We didn't know quite what to make him. He had lovely parents. And you'll see he's doing a pretty classic autistic, pushing her hand. This is before bubble guns for his data. Let her go. And I think at that point we thought, look, he's communicating. He knows what he wants, even though this moving someone's hand is not very efficient because you have to be right on top of them. It is a way of communicating, and we were quite hopeful. But his development has been very, very slow. So he is cognitively very impaired. He doesn't have any language. He is not difficult, except that he's continued to gain weight. And he's so big, it's hard to move him. No one wants to move him, but to get him to move if he's firmly planted somewhere. He has medication issues, which probably contribute to the weight gain, but are not responsible for it completely. I think the good news is here, we had seen him a few years earlier, and it's tried to set up a routine where we are doing high fives after something good happened when he was working with us. He did not want any part of it. But we came back, and you'll see what he's doing. I don't know whether his mom practiced with him or he just thought, aha, that's what they want. The other nice thing was we're trying to ask people what makes a difference in your adult child's life. And he had started taking a chair out to their backyard and a little table, and then he would get a pitcher of water and a glass, and he would go sit out there. And this was something he was doing completely on his own without asking his parents or asking for help. Quite a series of events. And his mom decided he was listening to the birds out in the backyard. And while that doesn't seem like much, I think for him it was a source of joy that he had initiated. And so how do we help young people do more of that? So you'll see what they're playing sort of soccer with it.
Ooh, almost. Score! Woo!
Not quite high fives, but still up.
Can I try? Oh, my turn. Oh, so close.
And he picked up the ball. This is new. In the past, you
Go!
let it stay. So there are tiny changes, but they're real and important. And I think the issues for him are, one, medical issues, because he's so heavy. We're concerned about that at the age of, at that point, 25 or 30, and other medical issues, and then what will happen to him as his parents age. This is what we used for people without intellectual disability, but with autism. And here we had the same thing. We looked at, do they have friends? And here they had to have a friend that was not related to them, that they saw regularly. We didn't count online. The next one was looking at where are they living? So the green are people living independently. And then have they had work in the last year? And 66% of our sample had work, but if you look at any given time, it's about 33%. So finding jobs is a huge issue. And again, here, things look better than they did for the less able kids, but we still have about a quarter of the sample that is not doing any of these things. And that's worrisome. So I'm going to quickly show you. This is a young girl. Actually, you can take my word for it. We're trying to do a birthday party, and she's trying to eat the Play-Doh. She is not impressed with the birthday party at all, which we've now replaced with a bath.
The birthday candles. Let's sing to this baby. Ready? Happy birthday to.
I'm going to go on. But this is the young woman at 19. She lives out in rural South Carolina. She is really smart, but she is very far from services, and her parents do not have a lot of resources. And so she is home all day. She lives in a trailer in the back of the house. And I think the worry is, how can we help her being way out there? She is looking at a picture of the United States, and they live in South Carolina. So you'll hear her comment about the Gulf state because it has little icons.
I see plenty of palm trees, but not oranges in Florida.
Yeah,
I wish I could get some oranges. I heard the oranges are delicious.
they're pretty delicious.
I remember, well, I do see a lot of country clubs around here,
Yeah.
but I don't remember enough in South Carolina being the Gulf state.
Mm-hmm.
No, now, of course, Washington, D.C. right here.
Mm-hmm.
I ain't gonna lie, I would love to go to New York if they have a Big Apple. Do they really have a Big Apple?
So they have, do you follow baseball? little bit?
Not really.
Not really. One of the baseball teams in New York, they have a big apple in their stadium, but I think that's the only big apple.
You
that
don't lie to
has.
me. Shoot, I
Only watched this about 100 times, and I finally realized she probably thinks it's a big apple, not a sculpture, but an actual apple, which is why it's so funny. But anyway, I think the worrisome is that she fell between the cracks. And back to the idea that autism affects how you learn and your opportunities. She can learn a lot, but somebody has to help her. And it is not possible in her current circumstances. I'm going to quickly show you. This is a little boy. You can see him. He is 2. He could talk a little bit. He has a very assertive mother who is on him all.
You don't want to spill it. Say cookie. Cookie.
That's his mom. I'm going to go to the next one just so you see him at 30. This is a young man who completed a degree in engineering in a very difficult university. It took him 6 years, but he did it. But then he did not really want to work. And he is now working at a playground, so better than nothing.
Oh, it's getting gregarious now.
Would you rather live in a cave or live in a treehouse?
Well, can I say it depends on the climate and stuff. Some places it might be more comfortable to live in a cave than say a tree house. You know.
Makes sense.
Well, and if you're in a place where it gets hot and humid, like say North Carolina, being in a cave would be far better than being up in a tree house. But in a tree house, unless you had like air conditioning fans or at least open windows, it would be unbearable.
That makes a lot of sense.
Because North Carolina humidity is something. And even though I've lived here my entire life, it still hits me. It still hits me like a colossal force.
So he has a lot of skills. But again, I think the question is, how do we get him to use them, or does he need to? Is it okay that he's working in a playground? I think his mother is worried, again, what's going to happen to him when he can't live with her. And my main point here, and we can make these slides available, is that we can help here. We can help adjust caregiver expectations, both sometimes down and sometimes up. We can help give parents techniques for dealing with behaviors that are difficult for any of us. And we can help support communication. I think one of the most important things for the kids or adults is making sure they know what's happening, that they understand, why are we doing these things? And are they going to be over? Are they condemned to sit and work with me forever? Or is this going to be short? And helping them learn to pay attention, to be frustrated sometimes, and to communicate. We need to remember that autistic people have strengths, and we can use those strengths to help find a niche for a child, and that there are different branches. And I think this comes back to some of the things people have been saying, just talking about different onset of seizures. Kids who are very active may need different strategies than kids who are not very active but really don't like to be around people yet. Kids who are quite socially directed but sometimes inappropriate need different strategies than kids who can't talk yet. So I want to thank you all again for letting me talk to you, and sorry I went over. And this is a group of all the people who helped us. These families have stuck with us for 32 years, which is quite amazing. And I see that's what you're doing as you work together. Thank you. Sorry.